Hi, and welcome to the 10 square metre workshop. In this video and the next, I want to talk about tracksaw improvements. Coming up after this. Tracksaws were invented and patented by Festool, and when the patent expired, many other companies started marketing their versions. I chose DeWalt, who did not just copy the Festool design, but created their own version. The most obvious difference is that the guide rail fence in the middle of the rail, not on the side. This allows both sides of the track to be used as a cutting edge. But this is not the main advantage. It is that the handle is in line with the guide fence. So there is no side force on this. Reduced friction and therefore wear, and it is inherently more accurate because of this geometry. Also, the joining bar for multiple tracks is in the middle, giving better location and alignment. One downside is that there is no solid edge for use against dogs on a table. But this saw has a second track, which means it can be used on other makes. It works on Festool track directly, and a slight modification to Makita track makes that usable too. Best of both worlds. The other big difference is that this saw does not pivot down, it cantilevers down, keeping the same angle. This means that the DeWalt has to use 6 bearings rather than 2, but it means the forward push also holds the saw down, reducing effort on the wrist. It also maintains the correct vertical position of the riving knife relative to the blade. Something a pivot saw can never do. DeWalt clearly takes this seriously. They have also added an anti-kickback device which can be disabled for plunge cutting. Another feature is its ability to cut close to an obstruction. It can put a cut 13 mm from, for example, a wall. It even has rubbing strips to make this easier. This saw also benefits from the superior airlock extraction connector. Does this mean that it's perfect? Certainly not. There are things that other saws have or are available as extras that the DeWalt does not have, but the important ones can be added. That's the subject of these 2 videos. In part 1 I will cover 2 modifications and a further 2 in the second episode. Even if you do not have or intend to get a DeWalt track saw, I hope that the process I go through will be of interest and spark ideas for your own equipment. The first is the provision of an outboard splinter guard. Whilst the side of the cut against the rail is supported against tear out, the outer side is not. Festool sell a small plastic part that adds support in the area where this blade is ascending, which is adjusted each time it's fitted. I've made a full length outboard support for the DeWalt. It uses features that already exist on the saw, meaning that there's no modification that could void warranty. Once adjusted, it can be slid on or off when required.
The materials needed are very simple. 400 mm of 8 mm steel rod, and 400 mm of 19 by 19 by 3.2 mm aluminium angle. 2 cap head 5 mm bolts, 2 hex head 6 mm bolts, 2 6 mm screw knobs, and some washers. That's it. In the UK there are metal suppliers, like Metals for You, who will supply the angle and rod mail order. I used aluminium channel for the main part, as that's what I had to hand, but angle needs less machining. If you can't get 19 mm, which is 3/4 of an inch, you can cut down larger angle. The main part is 305 mm long of the angle, the rest is used to the end spaces and the clamps. I cut most of the side of the channel off. The 8 mm is then cut into 2 180 mm rods, and one end drilled and tapped 5 mm. This is easiest on the lathe, as I am doing here, but it is possible to use a power drill. The hole does not need to be exactly central, it gets adjusted later. It is perfectly possible to build this with hand tools, but machinery does make it easier. Here are all the parts made. I turned up brass bolts, but hex bolts with the heads cut through to make them slimmer to fit the recess in the saw work fine. The clamps are made from small pieces of angle as shown. These hold the rod down and pull it inwards. Small pieces fit at the ends of the main piece to space it off the saw base. Attached with 4mm bolts from the top and then filed to stand 1mm proud of the side of the angle. This sets the spacing of the angle from the saw. Cut and fit some rubber splinter guard overlapping by 2mm on the inside. With the rods in place, offer up the angle and mark and drill the 5mm holes to take the bolts to the rail. Elongate the holes vertically by a couple of millimeters. On a flat surface, press the guard down while holding a bar up and tighten the bolt. Repeat for the other. If you've done this correctly, the strip will be flat to the surface, and putting downward pressure on the saw will cause the splinter guard to compress. The first step in using it is to make a full depth cut to trim the new splinter guard.
Here you can see it is trimmed about 1mm off the strip. With a sharp knife, trim this back to allow room for the riving knife. You don't need to be very accurate because it's not cutting on this area. So, how well does it work? I'm testing with a worn blade about halfway through its life. That's what will be used in practice, no point in testing with a new blade. I'm using melamine faced chipboard, a very fragile surface that is very prone to chipping.
Without the guard, it is clear there is more chipping on the outside of the cut, but with the guard there is really nothing to choose between the two sides. There is very mild chipping of both sides.
So, a useful accessory when you need to make outside cuts to material. Next up, the power cord. I've always regarded the Festool power plug at this tool to be an excellent idea, especially when you're feeding power alongside an overhead extraction hose. It simplifies the connection. I've modified my tracksaw to take a power socket. A warning, this will probably void warranty, and if you're not qualified, you should get your work checked by an electrician.
Bulk and miniature connectors. Part numbers and suppliers below. These are quality items, fully waterproof and locking. The tracksaw was almost made for these. Some small adjustments and the panel connector fits into the cable relief boss. With the plug on the end of the power supply lead, it gives an integrated power and extraction.
I'm not going to give great details on how to do this conversion. If you need that, perhaps you should not be doing it at all. Well, that concludes part 1. 2 more enhancements in part 2. See you then.